Content warnings for this episode include discussions of police violence against people of color, transmisogyny, queer coding, and the discussion of the real-life Ed Gein murders.
Greetings. You are listening to Horror Nerds at Church, a podcast where we take a deep dive into a horror film and talk about what it can teach us about God, the Bible, and each other. My name is Pace, and I am the vacant rooms on every single room in this poor hotel because of the way that the interstate highway system has ruined the motel community since then.
It was a strange commentary that I guess there wasn't any time to go into in this movie, but it's interesting that they kind of mention it as a side observation. Well, I'm Joe, and I am your friendly neighborhood cop who will stop you and watch you for a little while if I think you're suspicious, but otherwise I'll let you go if you're a white woman.
Yes, of course. Jeez. Oh, we can go into a lot for this film. This will be
Oh,
an interesting episode. So, yeah, I was going to say, but I thought it was too scandalous, but here I am going to say it anyways, that I am the vacancies in the rent by the hour motels. But
Oh,
too scandalous.
there's a Golden Girls joke in that.
And Psycho 2, he is released from prison, and he comes home to find that the person who was managing the hotel in his absence turned it into rent by the hour motel.
Oh,
So,
I mean, whatever works in this market, right?
yep. We are, of course, talking about the film Psycho, with the original, and so we'll talk more about that in a minute. But how are you doing, Joe? How's life been?
Life has been good. I love doing our podcast, and at first I was wanting to do this as just a really fun way to spend the time with you, but now I find myself like really like getting invested in the material, and I'm falling all of down all of these different rabbit holes, which can be good or bad depending on how you're looking at it. You know, I guess I'm becoming a little bit obsessive, but on the bright side, that works really well for our podcast, right? So
I know.
after we watched Psycho, I just read up on everything about the Psycho universe, and as I was telling you before we started recording, I want to try and start watching that Bates Motel TV show that was on A&E a couple of years ago. How
Yeah,
about
that
you?
reminds me of a Wanda Sykes joke about NASA, if you remember, where she basically called it welfare for smart people because it's like they're too smart to function in society. So it's like, just give them a telescope and tell them to look up and we'll pay them. And so I feel like the podcast, although we are not getting paid for this, is essentially the same thing. It's like, just give us a scary movie and then we are going to go way too deep into researching it and bring all that nerdery to you. That's why nerds is in our title. We truly are horror nerds and theology nerds.
Well, everyone needs something to focus on, right?
Yeah, something to take us out of the crushing reality of living in late stage capitalism.
Such a theological observation to make. How have you been doing, Face?
Well, I've been watching horror movies to escape the crushing realities of no, but well, yes, that is true. But also, it's been a pretty good week. It's Pride Month as we're recording this, and I think this episode is
Woohoo!
our last episode to come out in Pride Month, which is good because there's a lot of queer themes in this, which we'll get into,
Mhm.
many of which are problematic, but not necessarily all of them. But anyway, yeah, so it's Pride Month and things are going well. all the ups and downs are just uh, hard to catch
Yeah.
to stay on top of. But other than that, things are good. Oh, I have jury duty at the end of the month, so we'll
What?
see how that works.
This is the first time hearing of this. This is y'all see. This is what has become of our friendship. We no longer say regular things to each other in regular conversation. They come up through the podcast now. This is what happens when we become famous. But even though we're not being paid yet, actually, I'd rather be paid than be famous. So
Right?
God.
Give me that coin.
Seriously, oh man, my. Well, have fun at jury duty.
I know. I'm so looking forward to it. In a not at all way, because every time I've done jury duty, I'm a lifelong student, so I am always able to claim student exemption from it.
Hmm.
But I don't know if DC doesn't let you do that or what. They didn't give me that option, so I
Oh.
guess I just have to show up. So we'll see what that's like.
Wouldn't it be an ironic twist if you did end up getting into the jury and it's some sensational murder trial and then we'd have to continue the podcast without you?
Yeah, or like we get the trial of this man who dressed up as his late mother to kill people in his hotel, and that's the trial I'm stuck on.
Well, fun fact about the mother in this movie. The voice of
Norma,
the voice of the mother was played by three different voice actors. I did not know that.
I did not know that either. Who were? Can you say more about the three? I don't.
I only know that one of them was a name I recognize. I think the other two voice actors were, industry professionals. I believe one of the voices was a male.
Paul Jasmine. I'm looking at now on Wikipedia. Wow,
Hmm. So I guess all of those combined to make one motherly voice.
it is so strange. Okay, so I guess we can get into the movie now.
Mm.
Um, let me just pull up my notes. So, Psycho, uh, famous film, perhaps Alfred Hitchcock's most famous, I would say. Like, I mean, he's really well known and well
Definitely.
regarded, but I can't think of another film that gets as much pop culture recognition and references as this one, at least not
That
of his over.
That's why I thought I had already seen this movie. But then it turned out when you and I screened it for the podcast, it was my first time actually watching the movie. Like you're right, it's been mentioned and referenced in pop culture so often that I came to believe I'd actually watch this.
I know, right? Like it's very easy to see that to see like I can just close my eyes and get a shot for shot picture of basically the shower scene because you just see it so much in pop culture. But what
Mm,
what so it's produced and directed by Alfred Hitchcock based on the 1959 novel by Robert Bloch,
mm.
which itself was loosely inspired by the story of Ed Gein, the real
Ed,
life serial killer
huh?
who single-handedly inspired quite a few American slashers like
Yeah.
Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hannibal Lecter, all of those.
I had no idea that Psycho was based on, well, the book anyway. I had no idea that was who it was loosely based on.
Yep, a real life cannibalistic serial killer. So
I
Ed
I
Gein.
I feel like I should read up more, or maybe find a podcast like research of the true crime aspect, because yeah, this particular murderer has inspired so much of the horror genre. I I,
Yeah.
I don't know anything about him.
Well, he's from Plainfield, Wisconsin. So, Matt, if you are around, please tell us how close you grew up to Plainfield, since you're from Wisconsin.
Mm, yeah. Did you?
Have you heard of Ed Gein though? Like he's perhaps Wisconsin. Well, I think he is Wisconsin's most famous serial killer. But he yeah, Washara County.
Oh
Is
my
that
Lanta,
I
those
don't
those those wild Wisconsin names.
yeah. So he basic uh the county is Waushara.
I know a friend who.
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, essentially though, so um essentially between 1947 and 1952, he made as many, this is reading from Wikipedia, as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies.
Oh my gosh.
He left the graves in good order otherwise, but he would take certain, he would dig up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother, took the bodies home, and then he would tan their skins to make all sorts of things, such as he made a face mask out of paper bag and a skull. He turned Bernie Sworden's head into a burlap sack.
Oh my goodness.
A wastebasket made of human skin, skulls on bedposts, human skin covering several chair seats. So just this real life stuff happened. Just very, very bizarre crime, and really kind of one of the first serial killer in the United States to get like international attention, but especially
Hmm.
national attention.
I can see how the different things that he did with these bodies ended up being several different franchises.
Right? Like Leatherface especially, and also
Hmm.
Hannibal. Like you can kind of see a one-to-one correspondence there. But the mother
Hmm.
stuff, we really get in Psycho.
And Psycho, yeah, we do.
So but yeah, so uh first memories of this film, you mentioned that you think this may have been the first time you've actually seen it, but you've
Hmm.
also encountered it in pop culture before, and you've even mentioned to me that you've seen the sequels. So
Yeah, so I I I'm pretty sure I never saw the original Psycho, at least from beginning to end. I think when we screened it together, that was my first time watching this as a complete movie. That being said, as a kid, and y'all have heard me mention this many times during the podcast. My mom was fond of watching horror movies and taking me to them, or renting them and bringing them into our house. And I'm pretty sure that I watched the sequels when I was a kid, although I don't remember them. But I do remember thinking that it was weird seeing Norman Bates in color because that character was supposed to be in the black and white version of
yeah.
Psycho. So yeah, it was an interesting experience to say the least. How about
Yeah,
you?
yeah. What other Hitchcock films have you seen, and would you say are your
Mm.
favorite if you have any?
So, like many 20 something nerds, or I guess a lot of 20 something in general tend to go through phases like this. I went through a cinema phase, where I was studying all the quote unquote the greats, many of whom did earn that title. And I certainly went through a Hitchcock phase in my 20s. So I watched a bunch of stuff. I've seen Vertigo, I've seen North by Northwest, I've seen Strangers on a Train. There's an early one about, was it called did he do the 39 steps?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember watching that cuz that was an early one. And I remember my first reaction to that was this doesn't have his style yet. I mean, it's an interesting
Hmm.
movie, but I would have never been able to tell that this was off the bat Hitchcock. And I think out of every one I've seen, oh, that's really hard. It's really hard to say. I'll just pick Strangers on a Train because it was the gayest one. It
Right.
was so overtly homoerotic, but it's also a well constructed film, like everything else Hitchcock has done.
Interesting. Yeah. So I have seen Psycho before, but my earliest memory of seeing Psycho itself was actually seeing the Gus Van Sant remake in the
Ugh,
90s, because I'm pretty sure I saw
ugh,
that in theaters.
ugh.
Um, yeah, we'll talk about that because I also watched that for today. But so I saw that, but I of course had Psycho is such a huge thing in pop culture. I of course knew about Psycho even before I saw the remake,
Mhm.
even though I'm not sure if I had seen the original before then. I have seen the original a few times though. Uh, probably. Mo- earliest that I can remember seeing it the whole way through is in high school. But I watched it in college a few times. Kind of like you said, going through a cinema phase, watching some cinemas greats. For me, it was
Mm.
at that time watching a lot of horror greats because I've always been a horror nerd.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, but
Harder than college.
yes, yes. Uh, but yeah, so I have a lot of fond memories of this film. I watched so for today I screened this with Joe. It's the first time I've seen it probably in about 10 years, I want to say. But then I also watched the remake and I watched Psycho 2, both of which I'll talk a little bit about at the end. So
I want to show some solidarity with you for your first engagement with Psycho being the Gus Van Sant remake, which I wish didn't exist. But anyway, I think it's funny that my entrance into the Hitchcock cinematic universe, I guess, was through, the inferior sequels, inferior spin-offs, because like I said, I did remember watching the Psycho sequels as a kid. And I just remembered, I would be remiss to not mention this during our podcast. I watched The Birds 2 Land's
oh
End.
wow.
I don't know if anybody remembers that ill-begotten sequel to his classic The Birds, but I did see that as a preteen. It came out in the early 90s. It was originally made for Showtime, and yes, it was not good.
Yeah, I've not seen the birds too. But I have seen the birds. I guess trying to think of all the Hitchcock films I myself have seen. I think I've seen Strangers on a Train as well, but not for a very long time.
Mm,
Rear Window, I've definitely seen Vertigo, North by Northwest,
I think I
The
did see Rear
Birds.
Window.
I think Vertigo is my favorite Hitchcock film, but
Yeah.
Psycho is probably a close second for
Yeah,
me.
I love Vertigo by virtue of how gorgeous the Bay Area looks in it.
Right, that's the film that I think first made me fall in love with California, with San Francisco Bay Area in
Yeah.
particular. And then of course there was that awful 80s James Bond movie that everybody hates but I love, called A View to a Kill, which also is featured in San Francisco. So,
Oh,
and then of course Tales of the City, reading that as
yes.
a young gay high schooler. So like
Mm.
those three things just made me always want to visit San Francisco. And then lo and behold, I get my PhD from Berkeley, GTU in Berkeley. So
The-
right
it,
across the bay.
I think it's interesting that Hitchcock is able to um, find unsettling themes in a variety of locations. So with Psycho, we get this roadside motel, and then Strangers on a Train. We get this train, this lovely method of travel. And I watched that movie and I thought to myself, hey, I wouldn't mind traveling on that train, and not just because there are hot guys on it. And then we have San Francisco. North by Northwest starts out in New York City, and like the first 10-15 minutes of that movie are like a love letter to New York at that time, because New
Mm,
York looks so alive in those opening scenes.
yes, for sure. I That is something, like there's so much skill there. Uh and this film like is, some people call it the first slasher film, and we see
Mm,
some of those elements, like the point of view shot from the killer, and just you can see how much this movie impacted the slasher genre as a whole. But then also Halloween, like John Carpenter, there's so many references to this film. First of all, casting Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie is because the daughter
Janet, I believe Vivian was the great British actress.
yes, from King Kong, right? But yeah, so that, and then of course the character also called Loomis and Halloween,
Hmm,
so just a lot of crossover there. So it's kind of cool that we're doing this in our first season.
yeah.
We ready to walk through the film, or do you want any other kind of like thoughts before we get into it?
You know what? Yeah, I am ready for the walkthrough just because uh there was so much of the beginning of the movie and especially Marion Crane's backstory that came as a surprise to me vis-a-vis how I remember it being, talked about and referred to in pop culture. So I think that the walkthrough will be very informative in that respect.
Yeah. So as always, I watched it again and took my notes and kind of did a summary. So feel free to interject as I go, like usual. But so this is the film is picks up with Marion and her boyfriend Sam Loomis, and they can't get married because he's broke. At work, Marion is told to put $40,000, which is a lot of money, especially back then in 1960,
Mhm.
in the bank, and she decides to steal the money and drive to California to meet up, essentially to meet up with her boyfriend and give him the money so they can get married. A cop, which is who I believe Joe was referencing in the beginning, stops her after she spends the night in her car, and that freaks her out. So she exchanges her car. The cop is
Mhm.
very creepy, just for the record, as I think many are. But yes,
But in this day and age, a person of color would not have gotten that much of a chance to prove that they were a threat. Let's just say it. If
right.
Marion were black, she would have been dead long, long before she got to Bates Motel.
For real, it's just kind of disgusting the amount of privilege she gets, but also
Yeah.
there's kind of, even so, even I will go on record and say I do not think that Alfred Hitchcock has the best rating for racial awareness and sensitivity in his films, but he does pick up on the kind of sexism of the cop by having him like be
Yeah.
very like not trusting that this young woman alone by herself is up to any good, and just kind of
Right.
having this very like patronizing way of talking with her and following her around. So
Just because she's on her own. And the car salesman too is like, "Oh,
yes.
what's a little lady like you doing buying a car?" And it's like, what does that have to do anything, bitch?
Yep, it's a mess. So this is kind of like that timeless aspect of this film too, I think. uh
Yeah, timeless in the worst way.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Um, but yeah, so she exchanges her car and then she goes to the Bates Motel because it's like bad weather. She doesn't want to drive anymore. She's the only client at the hotel. Norman Bates, who's the proprietor of the hotel, offers her dinner, which she accepts. She overhears an argument between Norman and his mother, Norma. So she makes up her mind basically to go back to Phoenix and return the money she stole. Uh, so, but she's planning to do the next morning. So that night, though, she showers in the hotel. While showering, someone enters her room and stabs her to death. Most iconic scene, I think, is this shower
hmm
scene.
The
Uh,
most iconic scene and the iconic score too.
yeah, definitely. And then Norman then enters the room and sees what happened, panics and hides her body, car, and belongings, including the stolen money, in a swamp. Then we pick up with Marion's sister Lila, who confronts Sam, Marion's boyfriend, about the missing money and her missing sister. A private investigator named Arbogast. What a strange name.
Arbogast.
Um, also enters the picture and tries to reclaim the money. His search leads him to the Bates Motel. He questions Norman and then wants to question Norman's mother, but Norman refuses. While investigating the Bates house, he is killed by the same shadowy figure. Lila and Sam contact the local sheriff, who tell them that Norma has been dead for 10 years. The pair then go to Norman's house. Sam distracts Norman while Lila looks around. She discovers Norma's deceased body. Norman appears in a wig and dress and tries to kill her, revealing that he was the shadowy figure all along. But
Mm.
Sam overtakes Norman. We pick up later that Norman murdered his mother and her lover out of jealousy and has an alternate personality as his mother, Norma. We close out on Norman as we hear his internal monologue as Norma plotting to pin all of her crimes on Norman. The end.
Yeah, that's it. And so I think that what surprised me the most, like I said earlier, was Marion's backstory because generally in pop culture and everyday conversation, Marion is just someone who's on the run. And somewhere along the way, I got it into my head that she was on the run from a domestic abuse situation. I didn't realize there was money at stake and this illicit hookup that was going on and all of that kind of stuff. So that definitely surprised me while we were watching the movie.
Yeah. Uh, I think they went to kind of great lengths to problematize Marion, so that when she died, it was still very much a shock.
Mm,
And yet, also, you're not fully like sympathizing with her because,
right.
she is this thief and criminal. And it also kind of heavily implies that she and her boyfriend are having premarital sex.
Right, right. Yeah,
So, um,
exactly.
so especially for the sensibilities of the time, I think it's like going to great lengths to say she's not a good girl, so it's not okay that she's murdered, but she kind of had it coming.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas Lila is much more kind of the chaste and virtuous one out of the.
Yeah, she's the straight-laced sibling to Marion's character. Uh, and you can really deconstruct how they problematized Marion. One thing that is coming to mind for me is, she's stealing a large sum of money, from her boss who entrusted her to make that deposit. And um, I think that she had been working with him for a number of years. I want to say 9. It was mentioned somewhere in the dialogue. Anyway, she was a longtime employee, and all of a sudden, she steals this large sum of money and decides to escape. And then you deconstruct that, and you think to yourself, she's stealing $40,000 so she can afford to marry this guy, and it's like, you can really deconstruct and discuss the moral aspect of that for quite some time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Because she of course decides to return the money, so kind of before she dies. So it's kind of like trying to redeem her a little bit, but at the same time, it's kind of like implying that she just had this rash decision that made her decide to go off and do this,
Yeah.
and then the moment she came to her senses, she's like, "What am I doing? Of course, I'm gonna get caught. This is gonna be so stupid. Why? I'm just gonna return it, and hopefully they'll like accept my apology or something." So it's like so I mean, I guess they're still trying to show that she's not all bad. She's
Yeah.
not a fully bad apple.
Yeah, and I would be so interested to see more spin-off material where Marion is centered, because obviously people are going to milk Psycho for all the money that it can give, with Bates Motel being the latest iteration. Um, but I would be really more curious as well about Marion's backstory. What were the circumstances that led up to this fateful evening in the shower. It just seems like she's sort of an afterthought in all of the iterations going forward, and it's just all about
Yeah.
Norman, which is fine. But the Marion Crane character, I feel, is also a top build character. In at least in Psycho, the original,
Yeah.
it's not all about Norman. For the
Mhm.
first half of the movie, it's literally all about Marion.
Yeah, and that's one of the big fake outs because it you think she's going to be the protagonist, and you're not even introduced to the real protagonist Lila until this second act of the movie. So it's really this bait and switch that had not really been done in film before
Yeah.
like this, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's one of the innovative things that came out of Psycho. Talk about
Yeah.
those opening titles.
Oh
They
my
were
god.
so. If we're gonna use the word timeless to describe this movie, those opening titles. I mean, in today's world, you would see something really that visually attractive on a prestige TV show. I feel like one of
Yeah.
the things that would be on streaming on Netflix or something, or maybe HBO Max. And I can only imagine what the reception was like watching it during its time. I would love to travel back in time and experience watching this movie in 1960 because it looks so timeless. Like, it looks really modern. It's held up.
Yeah, and um it was shot in black and white as a cost saving measure because color film of course existed by then, and Hitchcock had already made quite a few films in color, but he used a TV crew as well to help keep production costs down because
Mm-hmm.
he was working on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, that show. So basically used his same TV show production crew and pumped this movie out pretty quickly, and yet there's just so much art here, and then with the score that you mentioned as well, just really there, it's a nearly perfect film, you know. It's hard from at least a visual and auditory standpoint.
Right. Yeah.
Plot wise is very problematic, especially by today's standards, but
Yeah, yeah, it definitely is, at least from the social aspect part. But from a purely structural cinematic aspect, I think it works really great. The fake me out is handled very naturally. It almost seemed to me as if there were, and I don't want to trivialize the murder scene. It was very violent and very effective for a horror movie, but it just seems to me like there was a handing of the reins from, okay, this is a movie about Marion, to, okay, now here is Norman's story. Like, it just
yeah.
seemed a very natural, transition.
And what's really interesting is just kind of the lasting effect that had. I'm thinking of Nightmare on Elm Street, how Wes Craven, in a deliberate nod to this film, has the main character be this blonde woman named Tina, and then she gets murdered in the first act by Freddy Krueger. And then we find out, oh, um, she's not the protagonist. Nancy was the protagonist. But like the film just sets us up to think that it's Tina all along who the film's going to follow through. And then just like this, we get this, just like in this film with Norman, we get a very charismatic villain with Freddy Krueger. So it's just, it created basically a pattern that we get quite a bit.
Mm,
And then, like with Friday the 13th, the twist ending of that, of course, being that the killer was Jason Voorhees' mother all along, Pamela Voorhees.
yes.
So it's like, so you can just see like the ripple effect that this film leaves in horror.
Yeah, yeah. There was a remake of the first Nightmare of Elm Street from 2010 that I recently watched, and I know we're gonna do the that franchise at some point in the future. But what I want to say right now about the 2010 remake of A Nightmare of Elm Street is that it actually upholds that pattern. It of a fake me out, because the 2010 remake has an entire opening sequence devoted to one character, this guy named Dean. He's very troubled and
Yep.
he's having these nightmares. And it turns out that the movie is not about Dean at all. I thought that was an interesting surprise. I think I have to say though, maybe I just haven't been paying attention that closely as I thought to the movies that I watched, or maybe it's just not something I was looking for, and that's why I don't notice these things. But the idea of a switcheroo regarding the protagonist, that's never been a trope that I'd pick up on, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah. And then we get the second act of the film, which is uh, changes it from horror into almost more murder mystery kind of, and you get kind of like this X-File setup with Mulder and Scully
It
between
totally
kind of
reminded me of
element
that.
with Lily and Loomis. So it's
Yeah.
like, or Lila and Loomis, I mean. So yeah, I just love, I love this movie. I will say when it comes time to rating it, I might rate it lower than you might expect, and that's only because the second and third acts of this really drag. It just, the pacing of the first segment all the way up until the murder of Janet Leigh's character is just like so well paced and is going somewhere, and then it's like the movie just slams on its brakes and meanders to an ending, and
Hmm.
it just kind of, especially today, I'm not saying that you can't have a slower approach in horror, because that can be very well done. Midsummer, we just did the last week, is an
Hmm.
example of this, like a very slow plot but still keeping up the suspense. In this film, like the suspense is gone as soon as uh Janet Leigh's character is killed, and then it doesn't really come back until the very end.
Yeah, yeah. It becomes kind of a procedural, um, uh, where they're trying to put the clues together and solve the mystery. Uh, for me, though, it worked. Uh, if you there's one way of looking at the movie at Psycho, and if I look at it that way, my takeaway is this movie is all over the place. It can't find its tone. In the beginning of the movie, it's like this thief caper movie, and then the last act of the movie is a procedural, and then when you really think about it, the iconic shower scene that established the entire slasher genre was really just that moment of Norman killing um, Marion, and then the work that he did to dispose the body. But like, it's not even the slasher aspect is not even a major feature of the film. You know what I mean? I feel like that's one thing that was pulled, and then to make all of these other movies, because it's the one that was the goriest, and the one that was most outlandish. um and that's one way of looking at the movie, is to think, well, it's all tonally all over the map. But for me, I think that Hitchcock's direction is the way he just handles the framing of everything, the way he goes from shot to shot. The tonal changes are not jarring. It feels like real life, because in real life, things can happen unexpectedly. A lot of left throws from left field will come at you, and that speaks a lot to Hitchcock's hand, that all of these different what would be competing and conflicting uh, tones in the movie just feel completely natural. Like, I didn't think I might have to defer from you uh, uh, from about what the procedural uh, uh, ending of the movie was, because I think that was a natural outcome. Like, Marion is dead. Now, obviously, we've got to find who did this to her, because I think if this movie were if Psycho were done now, and excluding Gus Van Sant's remake and all of the other slashers that came from this, I think that the next logical step would have been to have Norman go on a murder spree. I think killing Marion would have been the trigger for him to go on the murdering spree, and that would have been the movie. So I think it's actually kind of creative that after Marion's murder, the rest of the movie is a procedural in the X Files vein.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I think that's why some people who are kind of anti-horror or kind of snobbish about horror and think that horror is too much of a limited genre, so you can't really have great horror, they will then try to argue that this film is instead a thriller, and they would say that thriller isn't horror.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, this definitely is a horror film, um but it does have those thriller elements and the procedural elements, which kind of make it a genre defying in a creative way, like you're saying.
So I couldn't help pace but notice earlier when you brought up Arbogast, you kind of had a sneer in your voice. Am I wrong, or can you unpack unpack your reaction to Arbogast a little. And the context of me asking this question is, I thought Arbogast was an intriguing character, a very Hitchcockian character. You know, the prim and proper one who is a contrast to all of the movie's taboos. You get the Marion and her boyfriend taboo. You get the unnatural relationship between the mother and son taboo. And then here comes Arbogast who wants to put it all together.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with him. It just he felt like an afterthought of a character and wasn't
Mm.
really needed for to enhance the plot. But that's just it for me.
Oh, well, I thought the way that he was killed was just as innovative as the shower scene. Like when he's pushed down the stairs, uh it's a great visual that's happening in the background. It's like you're falling to it's like he's falling to his death and taking you with him, so to speak. And that really speaks to again Hitchcock's direction.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so that's one thing about this film, though, is it's just a artistic masterpiece. Like that can't
Mhm.
be denied. Plot a little weird, especially I want to at least say that films like this have depicted there that the character of Norman Bates is played by a gay man, and also is very queer coded. There's
Mhm.
some problematic ways that this film has been and the genre it kind of produced with films like Silence of the Lambs and stuff depict trans characters or characters that are appear to be trans,
Yeah.
and then how that is then weaponized by media and stuff like that to turn trans people into a threat, which happens like with real world consequences like the bathroom bill and stuff like that. So I don't want to discount the way in which this movie is part of that legacy and is problematic in that way.
Sure.
And that part just really doesn't hold up. I will say though that Psycho 2 kind of redeems the character of Norman Bates quite a bit, and that's why I think that at least in queer circles, I think it's a well-regarded entry into the franchise, just because it kind of plays Norman Bates as somebody who is like he what it kind of problematizes the narrative of Psycho and says, did he really commit those murders, or was that somebody else committing those murders and driving like taking advantage of his fragile mental state after the death of his mother and stuff like that. So it really kind of creates a different narrative that makes the Norman Bates character less of a stock character or a trans boogeyman sort of,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
for
turns
sure.
him into really a sympathetic character in Psycho 2.
Yeah. There's so much about this movie to think about. That's for sure. It wasn't regarded. It wasn't highly regarded when it first came out, right? It didn't make that much money.
Yep. It was it made 50 million at the box office, eight on against a budget of 806 thousand.
Mm.
So like this made bank.
Okay.
Huge. One of the early predecessor to what would become a blockbuster, because people say Jaws was the true first blockbuster, but this, which again another horror film, isn't that interesting. But this movie definitely uh could have been called a blockbuster. It was a huge success.
Yeah. Um, and
And part of
returning.
that is
Mhm.
because, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but part of that is because of the marketing campaign. Like there's that whole thing where Hitchcock basically said, don't spoil the twist for people to watch it, like said that in like an introduction to the film. And so it's like just kind of creating this mystique about the film itself. Like why would Hitchcock want the ending to be such a huge twist and stuff like that, when
Mhm.
that was, spoilers weren't really a thing back then. So kind of created, this film kind of created the whole spoiler, uh that whole idea of spoiler. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Interesting.
interrupt. That was a long tangent. Please
Uh,
go ahead.
It just feels, yeah, it feels like Psycho is the origin for so many things now that are we take for granted, that are just part of our everyday life in terms of watching anything that's related to genre, horror and thriller, and spoiler being one of them. I was gonna say that I wanted to return to the the subject of queerness in this movie, and well, first of all, the observation I want to make is that I thought Norman was very cute. I There may be something with me that I need to unpack regarding an attraction to creepy skinny white boys. But there was just I just found him so charming, and like I joked to you, Pace, during the screening of the movie, I would have totally been murdered because I would have totally bought into his charm.
Yeah, and that's kind of part of that charismatic serial killer, which is a trope in film, but also we see that in real life. Like, was his name Ted Bundy? Is that who I'm thinking of?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
very charismatic, charming personality. But I will say that Anthony Perkins is a very attractive man, and and plays this character very well. And then, especially in Psycho 2, I really want to watch that with you, Joe. Maybe we should do that for season 2 of this podcast,
Maybe we should.
because
I'd be curious.
I think it really makes him like a sympathetic and kind of adorable character, out on his luck kind of guy, in
Yeah.
the second movie, which I like, because it takes a hard left turn from the way these films usually go.
See, and I never considered myself to be one of those folks who is attracted to that type. Do you remember one of the Halloween movies? There was a scene, someone's listening to the radio and some woman is calling in about how attracted she is to Michael Myers. And
Yep.
I've just never been one of those folks, and even now, I've become so annoyed with the Netflix TV show You, which is about a stalker who happens to be a good-looking white guy, and they're legit like women in my community who are appalled by him being a stalker, and yet they're like, "Oh, but he's so hot." And like I have never been at least to what I'm remembering, I've never been attracted to, the murderous types. So watching Psycho with you and then, reacting the way that I did to Norman was a, a new experience for me.
Yeah. This is not going to be horror nerds at therapy, so we won't go much further into that unless you want to talk about your mommy issues that you may have.
Yeah. But as I told you during the screening, some pieces came to me. Some pieces came together to me while watching this movie. I remember in high school, one of my favorite horror movies was What Lies Beneath, directed by Robert Zemeckis, and that movie was made as a an explicit homage to Alfred Hitchcock, and so you could hear that in and not Alfred, Alan Silvestri's score to What Lies Beneath. He was very much channeling Bernard Herrmann, and then a lot of the shots that Zemeckis used were inspired by how Hitchcock shot a lot of Psycho. But another thing that came together to me was I realized finally why Michelle Pfeiffer and Harrison Ford were such a perfect casting for that movie. So growing up in high school, when I saw this movie, when I saw What Lies Beneath, I thought, I just thought of them as two actors who are really cool and who I really like, and they make the perfect couple for this kind of movie. And then it wasn't until I saw Psycho with you that I started thinking, oh, maybe they too are an homage to Hitchcock, because uh, Harrison Ford has like just the same facial features and the same gaze as as Norman Bates does, as Anthony Perkins does. Like I could really see the Harrison Ford vibe in Perkins, and then I could really see the Michelle Pfeiffer vibe in Janet Leigh as well. So um, yeah, so it just really, when I think about it, the range of how much Psycho has influenced so many other movies, and with so many of components of it, from the slasher genre, which came from the shower scene, and then the music from the movie, and then just the kind of casting that you want for a movie like this. Like, it can all be traced to Psycho, which I think is funny because it's kind of like a Genesis type scenario, which you know also brings up taste. Was there anything particularly theological you got from Psycho?
This is the thing. Like, there's a lot, but there's also not much at the same time. Um, I, I'm curious what you got because I'm trying to figure out. There's a few ways I could try to unpack this a little bit, but I'm not sure which one
Yeah.
I'm planning on.
I would like to hear what theological threads you pulled from it, because honestly, I didn't get any. And I was thinking about that because I was thinking to myself, well, we are watching these movies because we are coming at it from a churchy point of view, right? And then
Uh huh.
I also thought to myself, maybe every once in a while there's going to be a horror movie that just isn't churchy at all. There's just something random and fun to watch, almost as random as in Midsummer when one of the characters randomly mentions that the kids are in some other barnyard watching Austin Powers. Remember that?
Yep. Yep.
And so it seemed apropos of nothing. And so I think that's where I'm coming from in terms of Psycho and the theological themes. And I think that's okay. But
Yeah.
I do want to hear what you thought of it, coming from a churchy point of view.
Well, here's the thing. It's not real churchy, but I definitely wanted to the three basically I'll say the three things in brief, and if we want to unpack any of them further, then we can.
A
But
trinity.
yeah. So we have God the Mother and Norma, God the Son and
Mhm.
Norman, and God the Holy Spirit and the knife. I don't know.
God. Okay, so God in the mother is.
But no, for real, I think one of the things I want to talk about just briefly is the issue of problematizing women and sexuality that we see a lot in horror movies.
Yeah.
So that's of course an issue here. We of course see the character of Marion shirtless get like a rare like breast shot in a movie of this
Mm.
time, like a mainstream movie this time, and then she gets murdered while naked in the shower, like in a very vulnerable place, but also kind of like punishing her for her sexuality. So there's that issue. um the other thing we can talk about is we could get into like Foucault a little bit and talk about the history of madness and how madness basically is a social categorization that is created in order to um essentially lock away the disenfranchised from society or the undesirables of society, and so to base and then with the advent of the kind of scientific mindset and research to basically systematize madness and turn it into some sort of thing, and in a way that is not the same as the real life ways that mental health affects all of us, and many of us can be like, I have depression and anxiety and stuff like that. So those are real diagnoses. That's not what Foucault is talking about. Foucault is talking about just more the way that society treats madness and the way that it basically uses it to create an other. And so that this film kind of plays into that trope by creating, by first of all being called psycho, to use this essentially a slur
Right.
to label this person who has some sort of attachment issues to his mother, some sort of a murderous instinct, but to kind of call that like some sort of psychosis. It's just so it's using like these psychiatric terms, misusing them in ways to kind of problem to create a problematic stereotype of like what mental illness looks like. So
Hmm.
that kind of plays into it too. So that's one other aspect. And then the last aspect is just visually the trope, the kind of the artistry of this film and how that kind of connects to the artistry that we use, to the way that we use certain kind of very religious symbols about natures of good and evil and God, to angels, all this stuff, to use light and darkness in ways that thankfully are being problematized about racial connotations of those. But
Yeah.
just the way that Hitchcock has this really innate sense to use these visual tropes, which come from this long history in Western art, at least, of creating religious art and creating these tropes through religious art and symbolisms.
I like that. Yeah, that helps me to going forward as we screen other movies, um try to see if I can pull up theological strings from the movie when I think that there are none. I like the direction that you went in this about going to art and using symbolism to kind of stimulate some theological perspective on this movie. I love it.
Yep, but that's all I got. So not much of a deep dive for any of it, but at least three kind of things that were swirling around in my head as I watched it. Anything else
Mhm.
you want to say about deep dive stuff, or should we move on?
Psycho does a interesting job of presenting at least two taboos: the affair at the beginning, and then the relationship between a parent and child, especially mother and son. And not, I don't think it was done in a way that exploited the taboos. I mean, certainly they were amplified and dramatized for the movie, and then of course Norman Bates turns out to be a serial killer. But I think if there were one theological parallel, I think what Psycho has most in common with is at least the Hebrew Testaments and all of the sorts of various shocking things that happen there between people actually,
Hmm.
and not without the direct involvement of God. So
Yeah, yeah,
um,
I agree. I guess. Oh, and just we didn't get into this, but just to quick talk about the remake by Gus Van Sant in
why?
1998 is so weird. It's just practically a shot for shot remake, although we
Hmm.
do get to see Viggo Mortensen's bum, which is nice.
Oh,
But in the opening scenes, but it's okay. I like it. I like what he's trying to do, and but at the same time, it's just like why?
yeah, my memory of that coming out into the movie theaters was I was in high school when that came out, and uh that was the peak resurgence for the horror movie genre because of what Scream had done. And so I was sort of, riding on the vibes of Scream in wanting to see the Psycho shot for shot remake, and I didn't. I never got around to seeing it in the movie theaters, and I finally did watch it years later, and it did not inspire me to go watch the original. And so, if that was the intent, then it just backfired because it's to me it was gimmicky. And now that I've actually watched the original, that shot for shot remake really pales in comparison. I mean, Vince Vaughn in the Norman Bates role, no, he's not even half as attractive.
Yeah, yeah. I 100% agree. And he really kind of ups the creepy factor. Whereas I think definitely Anthony Perkins' portrayal is creepy, but it's like
Well,
this innocent creepy, whereas
right.
whereas in the remake it's it's more like off-putting, and like it
Yeah.
just feels really forced too. It's not good. Not good.
Absolutely. It's played up. It's almost exploited whereas Anthony Perkins' Norman was creepy in that, sinisterly insidious way. It's
Yeah.
subtle. But the way Vince Vaughn played it was just like to be, "Arr, I'm weird." And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, no.
We need to watch Black Hole, a Disney film with Anthony Perkins in
Oh
it. He
yeah.
is so fantastic in that movie.
Is
I
it
love he's adorable. I love that movie. Yeah, we need to
is
watch
it
it.
science fiction?
Yeah, it's
Or-
basically it
Oh.
came out in the wake of Star Wars, as pretty much every studio tried to make their own Star Wars, which is how we got the Star Trek, the motion picture, and all
Mhm.
that. Everybody trying to make their own Star Wars. And Disney's attempt was the Black Hole, which was really well done. It's basically 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but set in space.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds like something I'd like to watch.
Yeah, and it's horror enough that I think it would work for our podcast. So
Yeah.
maybe come into season 2. Or for Patreon, Joe and I talked about maybe doing movie commentaries. So maybe we could do some of the stuff that isn't quite horror, like True Lies and Black Hole. We could do movie commentaries for our Patreon or something.
Maybe, yeah, that would be fun. Just to step out of horror every once in the blue moon.
Or we can do like Star Trek watch alongs. Watch some of your favorite Voyager episodes or something.
Hmm. Well, my commentary will never end, so I don't know if we want to subject our audience to that.
Yeah, but we can hear your convention horror stories.
Yes, there were some horror stories at the convention. Sadly, most of them were of my own making. But you know what?
So,
This is bringing up a really interesting um, point, and I don't mean to go on a tangent, but Star Trek has flashes of horror that were really interesting. If we could
yeah.
probably legitimately do a podcast episode about that. We could do um, Wrath of Khan. When they ended up on the Genesis planet, that was so creepy.
Con!
Yeah, well, and you know what, and that's what people remember, but like the build up to it was kind of scary. Or even in the first movie, the motion picture, that transporter accident, uh
Yeah.
that's a tone that Star Trek never went back to that often with. Like it just they just decided to really go with the optimistic, everyone gets along in the future kind of deal. But you do have flashes of it, the episode of Next Generation called Conspiracy, with the dangerous bugs aliens
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So yeah, Star Trek
Yeah,
has it has its moments in horror.
there's some good body horror too. Like no one can ever forget that dream that Data has of the cake that he's cutting. Like that's some solid body horror, not for Star Trek.
Exactly. Yeah. It was mint flavored, I
Ew.
recall. And
And then even Star Wars goes into horror a little bit. Of course, like Darth Vader being iconic, like kind of horrific figure, but and Darth Sidious, the Emperor, and all that. But if you have not had the opportunity to watch the Ewoks Caravan of Courage, which is a made for TV movie from the early 80s that Lucasfilm did and is now available on Disney Plus. It is like family horror, like Disney-fied family horror, but like set in the Star Wars universe. It is just a wild. It's not a good movie, but it's it's a wild it's a wild movie. I'll just say that.
hmm, sounds like something to dig up. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll rate the film. This is gonna be a short episode. I'm excited. Not because Psycho is not deserving of a full length episode, but I just think that there's not much to say that hasn't already been said because it's been analyzed and by everybody, and it's basically a
Yeah.
perfect film. So
It's definitely iconic. Like it deserves that title, that's for sure. Something that's iconic. And I believe it's one of the movies that's preserved by Congress or something like that. So very
yeah,
much very much earned. Okay, so my film rating It's hard. It's hard to come up with a solid number because of of a lot of the things that we talked about. Um, but in terms of how well it all comes together, and considering Hitchcock's direction, I'll be giving it a 7 out of 10.
Nice. That's less than I thought it would be, but
Mm.
still a
Yeah,
solid rating.
I was really close to doing an 8, but there's certain things that are pulling me back from giving it that 8. But I'm gonna give it that solidly respectable 7.
Sounds good. Yeah. What about favorite kill? I'm sure probably Marion, because what else could it be? But
Actually, yeah, you know what? I'll echo what I said earlier. I really like the way Arbogast was killed off. You
that's
know,
true. That's a good death.
like falling down the stairs has never looked so entertaining. Is that the right?
Yeah. Well, also the reveal of Norma's deceased body was pretty like
Yes.
shocking, and the um set design or makeup artist or whatever it is that they did to put that together was just really well done, especially
Hmm.
in black and white.
Mm, yeah.
Nowadays it'd probably be all CGI'd corpse or something really fake looking.
Exactly. There's so much about this movie that is so good for when it was made. For 1960. What about
Yep.
you, Pace? What's your verdict?
I would say I was going to rate it really high, but I think our conversation and your more respectable rating is pulling me back. So I'm going to rate it an 8 out of 10. I was originally thinking
Mm,
9 out of 10, but
hmm.
I think we kind of brought up kind of the pacing issues in the second and third act,
Yeah.
and shift in tone there, and then also some of the problematic ways it's been used, like in anti-trans and anti-queer ways,
Right.
and then of course kind of what you were saying too, like it really holds up in most ways, but some ways it kind of doesn't. So but yeah,
Yeah.
so 8 out of 10.
And for me, I think the Hitchcock movies that come close to hitting that perfect 10 would probably be Strangers on a Train and North by Northwest. But
Mm.
suffice it to say, Psycho is definitely in league.
Oh, for sure. There's a reason it's a classic, no doubting that. um okay, well, do you want to announce the next movie because it's one of your picks?
It is one of my picks, and it's one of my personal favorites. For next week's show, we will be doing the 2002 American remake of the Japanese film Ringu, and that, of course, was remade into The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski, starring Naomi Watts, and as the creepy little girl, Davy Chase, who was also Lilo in
From
Lilo
Lilo
and
and Stitch.
Stitch.
Yep, I love it. So yeah, come back for that. I have not seen this film since probably in theaters when it was out, so it's been a long time, so I'm excited to
That's a
revisit
good
it.
that's a good way of watching it. I thought that was a very theatrical movie, a good
Yeah.
experience to see in the auditorium. Yeah, so come on by and check us out. Is there anything else you wanted to wrap us up with, Pace?
Nope, I think we're ready for the
Yeah,
outro.
no, that's it for our show. Our theme music was by Matt Nay, who also edited this episode. Thanks, Matt. Horror Nerds at Church releases every Thursday. Please comment, rate, and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Horror Nerds at Church. We're also on Twitter at HNAC Pod. That's HNAC POD. For all the latest updates about upcoming films, news, and other announcements. Until next time, if you're having an illicit hookup, could you just do it the old fashioned way? Meet someone on Grindr and then go home. Don't have any fantasies that involve you stealing a lot of money from your boss, because you know what, it's just going to be a lot of trouble in the long run. I mean, at least in this day and age, an STI, can be dealt with just one shot at the doctor's office. But if you're going to steal $40,000 from your boss, to run away with that Saturday night mistake, I mean, that's a lifetime consequence, friend.
Right? Or like check out before you book a room, like check out ratings on Yelp or wherever else. Make sure that's not
Exactly.
a murder hotel. I mean, just double check.
Just imagine how different Marion's life would have been if Tinder existed back then.
Or even like fuck it, even like TripAdvisor or something.
All right, it's been great having you all. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. Okay, bye.